The reason why you click this video is because you wanted to understand how editing a podcast looks like. You either have a podcast or are thinking of starting one. Either way, you want to understand this game because there are millions of podcasts in the world and only a tiny percentage of them actually get the views, accolades, get the recognition. So you want to be in the top 1%. And I also read the stat. If you post more than 3 episodes, you're in the top 10%. Just imagine that. And if you've posted more than 21 episodes, you're in the top 0.01%. So it's easy to be great with podcasts because the barrier to entry, the competition is so low that it's so easy to win. But the problem is most people do it in a wrong way. They go on Zooms, they upload some shitty ass video without proper processing, proper editing, and they never get a chance. Even though the information is solid, it's gold, it never sees the light of the day. And that's exactly why you need a post-production help. You cannot just slap a raw video on YouTube and hope it goes viral, because it might have worked 10 years ago, but right now it won't. That's the reality, because you gotta understand it's a different game now and everyone's playing this game. So if you're playing to win, you gotta make the best moves. But if you're thinking, oh, I'm just gonna keep it raw, if the information is good, people would find it. No, Bible is the best information in the world. Quran is the best information in the world. Bhagavad Gita is the best information in the world. It's the most interesting, dramatic stories, novels of all time. How many people actually have read Bible or Bhagavad Gita or Quran? Only a tiny percentage. Why? Because you need packaging. That's why people give sermons. That's why people explain. There needs to be someone who explains, because it's not that easy to read. So in this video, I'm going to explain how I edit a podcast, how I look at it, how I psychologically pick the right moments, cut out pauses and the mindset and everything. So it's going to be a jam-packed video. So please pay attention. Make the video full screen. Don't look at other videos. Just listen, because it's going to be life-changing if you have a podcast or thinking of starting a new podcast. So there are 3 parts to editing a podcast. The first being intro, and the second being the conversation, the podcast itself, and finally the outro. The outro consists of your logo, your brand assets, and some kind of a sonic branding, like a signature song or music that you'd like to use at all your outros. Same goes for intro, but intro is a bit complex. I'll explain each and everything separately. First of all, let's begin with intro. Intros are the most important things to a podcast, because everyone decides whether they want to watch your podcast or not within that 1 minute. You gotta sell your podcast to your audience, or else they're gone. So the first thing, intro. How do you edit an intro? There are a lot of aspects which I will get into. The thing with intro is it's the most important thing and should be treated that way. The second one being the conversation. You might be thinking, okay, it's just a conversation, it doesn't need much editing. And I get annoyed when people come to me and say, oh, it's just a podcast, it doesn't need that much editing. What do you mean? What do you mean? It's not just black and white editing. You just slap that video, sync them together, and then magically it just performs well. No, you gotta cut out the fluff. If I see a conversation that leads to nowhere, I have to cut it. And no one notices it. You might not believe me, but no one notices a cut in a podcast. I'm telling you, a lot of big podcasts cut a lot of their conversations, a big chunks of their conversation, and people wouldn't even notice. And you gotta have that kind of a control with your content. If you're just putting out everything, it will affect your reputation. So that being said, conversation, the podcast itself, editing it for the pauses, the mispronunciations, maybe they take breaks in the middle, some conversations that lead to nowhere, plain fluff, you gotta remove them, right? And finally, the outro. Outro doesn't need to be that fancy. It can be subtle. It needs to have your logo. It can be subtle and some kind of music. I like to use hip-hop genre music in my videos because I like to associate myself with that kind of vibe. Whatever vibe you want to go with, we gotta pick the right music for that. Simple as that. Outro doesn't need to be that fancy. If you have a call to action, that's when you need a little bit of editing there. Maybe you're shouting out your other videos, or you're asking people to go click a link, download something, get a free discount coupon or something like that. As a whole, these are the three aspects of a podcast. So this covers the video part. What about the audio? Because Spotify and Apple Podcasts and Google Podcasts and a lot of other platforms, you gotta understand you also have to upload the transcript and the show notes. You gotta say people in text format why this podcast is really important. Of course, intros for videos is important, but you cannot bank on that when it comes to audio podcasts, because the thing is, people are just listening. They're not visually stimulated. So that's why you need a compelling argument in written text so that people can read, okay, here are the things that I'm going to learn, and here's a summary, like a TLDR, too long didn't read, summary of the podcast. I like what I'm seeing, so I'm gonna take a bite and see what the conversation is all about. And they listen, and 5 minutes in or 10 minutes in, they would judge you. When you do a podcast, always ask the most interesting, the most controversial questions in the first 20 minutes. Don't ask boring questions. Oh, where are you from? What do you do? Shut the fuck up. No, don't do that. You can keep that in the middle. Although it's for another YouTube video, just ask the most juicy, controversial, most pressing, hot questions in the beginning. If you're a podcast host, you gotta understand, keep that in mind. The first 20 minutes, it's gonna decide whether your podcast will take off or not. So bear that in mind. All in all, if you club them all together, there are 5 aspects to successfully marketing and getting views for a podcast, which are intro, the conversation, and the outro. And finally, when you post on all platforms, you need show notes and transcript. Simple as that. So now let's dig in. First step, assimilate and rough cut. So the first process that I follow when editing a podcast is rough cutting, watching and assimilating the information. Here's how I edit a podcast. So whenever my clients share like a 2-hour long or 1-hour long podcast, what I would initially do is I would transcribe the entire podcast and make it a PDF, and then feed that PDF into ChatGPT and ask ChatGPT different questions. Okay, what is this conversation all about? What are the hot topics? What are the key moments? What do I need to learn about this industry? So I get a summary, get a bird's eye view of what the conversation was all about. And then once I've understood, once I've had a little bit of lay of the ground of what's really happening in the podcast, then I can go and watch the podcast myself manually. And then I would sit there during the boring parts. I would just fast forward it, and then I would genuinely sit down and listen to the conversation. While I'm doing it, I would just mark in and out the key moments, and I would just keep watching it, because you don't want to edit or chop while watching, because I used to do that in the beginning, but it proved to be not useful. So I switched to just watch the video in the beginning, mark the key moments, and then get to editing. I wish someone had given me that advice. Now you have me, so you don't have to make all the mistakes that I did. So after watching and marking all the best moments, what I would do is transcribe and put the timestamps of each sentence and upload it to, again, ChatGPT. And I would give a different prompt now, which is, hey, this is a conversation between so and so. I want to do a podcast clipping where I need the best moments for me to edit that goes really viral. So start with a controversial statement, and it should have a beginning and an end. I have this ginormous prompt that I feed to ChatGPT. Now it knows, now it becomes my agent, my assistant, and it goes into that PDF. It literally squeezes each and every moment from the podcast, and it gives me with the timestamp, and it doesn't summarize, it doesn't do any of that shit. It just gives me the exact words the speaker said and the exact time code of those highlight moments. And when I ask the ChatGPT to generate those things, I also ask it to create a title, and I also give it some copywriting tips to write the title, which should be less than 50 characters. No, not 50, 35 characters. And it should have some kind of a power word and have a emotional trigger, something like that. I would have a prompt for that. And then once you feed it, it gives you like 20 to 30 really juicy moments from the podcast. Now, what we've done is taken the podcast, dissected it, broken it down. Now we've assimilated all the information. Now we know the podcast inside out better than the host. Editors understand the video's story better than anyone else because we have to, because we are the one telling the story literally. We are the one shaping the narrative. So once I get all the information, it takes a lot of time. As you know, good work takes time. Before anyone thinks editing is just a job, no. It's an art form. It requires a lot of dedication and awareness, kind of a mindfulness when you edit. You can't just be absent while editing. You gotta be there like an athlete. It requires so much mental horsepower when you sit down and edit because it demands a lot of creative power from you. It's the most tiring, exhausting, and the most rewarding experience. If you are in any type of creative environment, it could be anything. You could be in engineering, or even you could be in an accountant. If you're creating solutions to the existing problems, then you are a creative. So yeah, sorry about that rant. Actually, I'm not sorry because I know it was useful for you. Now, we've cut down all the clips, right? We have 20 to 30 clips from an hour or an hour and a half podcast. Now everything is ready for intros. You don't edit just yet. You just pick 5 to 6 at max. Not all the clips would go viral. There are some moments in the podcast that would really be good, and you gotta understand which ones they are, and then you gotta separate them and keep it separately. Like a copy, don't move them. You take a copy of them and then store it separately for the intro video. So now you have done all the rough cuts. You don't even have to worry about chopping them if the moment is right, if the story lines up. You don't have to worry about anything. You just have to go and edit. That's it. So that's the rough cut part. Step 2, video editing. This is the most time consuming part in editing a podcast. It's not easy, and don't think it's gonna be so straightforward like people like to claim in the advertisements, like they're trying to push an app that does everything for you. No, it won't do everything for you. You gotta understand that first. So when you edit a podcast, the first 2 things that you need to look at: number of camera angles and the mics. And once you line up all the clips and sequence them and sync them together, now you do the cuts. So when editing a podcast, it's usually straightforward if you have only one guest. If you have 2 or more guests, that's when you gotta understand, okay, number of speakers. Usually 2, mostly 2. If there's more than 2, then you also understand there's more than 3 camera angles. And that's when it gets tricky, but let's stick to 2 people doing a podcast like Joe Rogan style. 2 different camera angles and 1 shot, wide angle shot. And that's that. It's pretty straightforward. You just create a multi-sequence timeline and then you sync all the clips. Boom, you're ready to go. Everything is aligned. Now you do the rough cuts, everything is placed. Now you have 15 to 20 clips. This is where now I'm confused. Okay. Now it comes to video editing. Editing the podcast, as I said, it's pretty straightforward. You gotta step 2, video editing. There are 2 things you want to do when editing a podcast. The first one being you edit the podcast itself, and the second one being you clip the podcast into highlight moments and then you edit them individually for short form platforms. So these are 2 different things you need to do. First of all, you do the long form edit where you cut out the pauses, mispronunciations, any breaks people take, boring things that they talk that you don't actually think adds anything to the viewer, adds any value to the audience. You can cut that out. Obviously with the client's approval, but you gotta understand it's a symbiotic relationship. They gotta understand you and you gotta understand them. If they're giving you the podcast, they're trusting you with that podcast, and you should make educated decisions. And sometimes you gotta cut. An editor would cut brutally because they don't have any attachment with the recording process. They don't have that ego. All they're thinking about is what would the audience like? How can they tell a better story? That's what a video editor does. So we cut the things that are not adding any value to the conversation. Maybe you had a laugh. Maybe it wasn't that big of a joke. Take it off. Not even a good joke. Even if it was a failed joke, that would be insane and funny. But some people are just boring, man. During those conversations, I would just fucking cut it. I don't like to keep those parts. I wouldn't listen to that. So under the video editing umbrella, you have two different types of editing. One is podcast editing and one is short form editing. So podcast editing involves cutting out the mispronunciations, the pauses, the filler words, the absurd things they shouldn't have said that should be cut, the non-contextual conversations or some bizarre, boring thing that a speaker says out of anxiety or something. We got to cut them all out because they don't add anything to the conversation or add any value to the audience, so we got to take them off. So this is it's pretty straightforward. You just have to sit down and go through that mammoth of a footage and then be like a psychopath and watch in every single second and cut it out. It's not just, you're not jump cutting every single pause. That's not what I mean. What I mean is you gotta be like a doctor with a scalpel trying to find that tumor in the video and then removing it. You're not trying to cut every limb, every nerve. No, that's not what you're trying to do. You're just trying to find which moments really suck and you're going in with your scalpel, surgical knife, and removing them. That's it. That's what you do. So that's that with the podcast editing. And then finally you come to short form editing. This is where it gets really, really interesting, exciting, and sometimes resentful. I don't want to talk about it, okay? It's a love-hate relationship when you edit videos. So when you edit videos, you got to understand there's the hook, the title in the video, and you got to have one takeaway per video, not more than one takeaway. And then finally, a call to action. Maybe you ask the people to watch the entire podcast, or you send them to your website to buy something from you or download a free lead magnet or something like that. So that's what short form editing consists of, but I'm not going to go deep into short form editing right now just yet because I'm going to create new videos in the upcoming days, so stay tuned. This video is just to give you an overview of how I edit the podcast videos for my company, JD Productions. And that's that for video editing part. And finally, the outro comes. The outro could be, you can create the outro once and then keep using it again and again. It doesn't have to be that complex. And step 3, outros. Outros doesn't have to be so complex. It's pretty straightforward. All you have to do is pick your logo, pick the right music and some of the visual elements, brand assets that you have, follow the brand colors, create a badass outro, and that's it. Last impressions count too. So you gotta leave them in style. Like you gotta leave them on a high note. So that's what outros do. Hype music, hip hop, or some kind of classical baroque music, that would do. Yeah, it depends on what mood or vibe you're going for. So that's what I would do. Those are 3 steps of editing a podcast for videos. And finally, the show notes and transcriptions. You can actually ask ChatGPT to write it and then rephrase certain things, add your own flair, add a bit of copywriting basics so that people would actually read. As copywriting basics, I'm going to give you like a 30-second overview of what copywriting is. I'm not going to explain the definition, but you know what copywriting is, right? Making persuasive argument to make people do something or buy something. You're making a persuasive argument, making a case for someone to take an action. Hey, I want you to dump your girlfriend. Here's why. Boom, boom, boom. Done. No pun intended. Pretty much everything about show notes. That's step 4, show notes. And finally, step 5, transcription. There are a lot of transcription services that you can go for, or if you can ask ChatGPT, you can do a vague job, but I'm not sure if this is the right job. Let me actually check if there's a resource where you can get the transcript. Use a transcription service that can identify different voices and separate their dialogue. Okay, pretty much. There are softwares. You can get a subscription if you're doing podcasts regularly, and you can actually pretty much do that pretty easy. That could be done. Now let's get to the juicy part, intro. How do you edit an intro? Here's the formula. You take 3 best moments from the podcast. That's it. No more than 3 moments. Just pick 3. And what you have to do is make an argument. People believe that they have to watch the podcast right now. You gotta fill them with that desire to watch, to actually consume all the information. Here's the thing, you gotta tease people into watching it. You gotta make a case that it's now or never. Because everyone knows if they miss watching that podcast now, they're never gonna watch it. It might get lost. They might never get around to it. They might even never find it. So it's imperative, it's in their best interest that they actually watch the podcast right now. But you got to make that feeling, you got to plant that feeling inside their mind. How do you do it? By picking the best 3 moments and you cut out the reward portion of that content. Here's how you make $1 million. Step 1, don't do it. Don't give it to them. That's the pretty basic definition that I can give you when it comes to teasers or creating intros. You just don't give everything just yet. They can get it if they watch the full podcast. They're not getting it in the teaser. So that's why it's called a teaser. You got to tease people into watching the entire podcast. So that's that. And then secondly, when you're editing a teaser, you got to collect all the assets, be it sound effects, music, transitions, B-rolls, typography, animations, and all that stuff, so that they are hyper stimulated, they are fired up, they want to go and watch. Let's say you're hosting a podcast in the health space and you're talking about cardiac health, and you have the biggest cardiologist in the world, and he's explaining to you how 99% of the people are doing this mistake and they're actually killing themselves. Every person above 50 will have this disease if they don't follow this routine. It's a simple routine. It's a 5-minute routine, something like that. And what you have to do is create anticipation for that moment. So you got to hype up that storyline. Okay, people have to listen to this. As an editor, I need to care about the subject more than anyone else. That's when I can sell it properly. If not, it'll just be a mediocre job. That's why I always make sure to really understand the topic people are talking about. I'm naturally a curious person. I'm a seeker of truth. That's how I like to identify myself as. Everyone says, well, what are you? What are you? And it's such a philosophical question. Who are you? You're not your name, you're not your position, you're not the person from this city, you're not this religion. No, who are you then? And after giving it a deep thought, I came to the conclusion, okay, what do I feel good about? What am I naturally inclined to do on a given day? I'm just curious. I just want to explore, learn, and try new things, play with new things, master new things, solve new problems. That gives me and fills me with joy. So I'm a creator. I'm a seeker of truth. I'm a curious adventurer. That's who I am. That's the conclusion that I came to after pondering it for a very long time. So if you follow all the things that I said, you would edit a badass intro or teaser. Now let's go to the short form clips, how to actually edit them and make them go viral. So when it comes to picking the right moments, the highlights, I have written down a lot of things here. So I'm just going to read it, and you don't have to memorize this. You don't have to keep these things consciously in your mind. But just when I read this list, just have a sense or idea of what this looks like. And when you sit down to edit, you would exactly know what to do. Our brains are so smart. Just going to read this and then you're going to just get it. Even if you don't remember half of what I said when you sit down to edit, or even 90% of what I said when you edit, it doesn't matter. If you can just remember 1 or 2 things that stand out when I read this thing, that's all that matters. You can, again, watch this video or watch my upcoming videos. I would be repeating all these things again and again, reminding you in different ways so that it connects in your brain. So you don't have to worry. So I'm just going to read it right now. Cut out pauses, repetitions, boring sentences, mispronunciations, capture quirky body language, unique words, high energy moments, controversial statements, interesting stories, quotes, opinions about a hot topic, crucial inside information of industry, some kind of a secret, jokes, funny moments, surprising turn of events, something happens in the podcast, something stirs up, angry moments, vulnerable moments, motivational thoughts. So all these things, when you edit, you got to look out for them and then capture them, cut for them. That's all I had here. Can you see? Those are my notes. So those are the things that I wanted to share with you today. In the upcoming videos, I'm going to keep posting a lot about editing, how to tell a better story. If I want to do tutorials, I would, but I'm not going to just fit into one mold with my channel. I'm going to experiment. Right now, I'm a business owner. I run a post-production company. I do all this to get clients. Let me be really clear. I'm doing all this to teach as much as possible in the hopes that someone would actually like my style, like what I said, like my conviction, like my guts, and finally give me an opportunity and give me their business. That's the whole premise. So I'm here to sell. I'm not going to say I don't have anything to sell. I have things to sell. Meanwhile, I'm not having any information to sell. That's the thing. I don't have courses. I don't have any community. No, not yet. Never say never. So not yet. But for the next 2 years or 3 years, I really want to focus on building my agency into 8-figure, on even possibly 9-figure in the next 5 years or in the next 10 years, 15 years. I'm going to learn as much as I can from all my mentors and everyone. I'm going to keep posting videos. I'm in the game, man. I'm 27 years old. I'm in it for the long haul. I'm going to keep making videos even before my deathbed. I'll be, hey, homie, I'm going to deathbed. I think I'm going to die tomorrow. Anyway, it was a wild ride. Peace out. Be good kids. Read books. I'm going to keep saying all those things and we'll see. And I'm not anymore ashamed of my dark inner self. Some of my insecurities, sometimes I might mispronounce certain words and I would actually be really embarrassed about myself. But right now, I understood from the years of experience that I had, you ought to make mistakes to actually become better. If you are crippled by the thought of making a mistake, you should also be crippled by the thought of improving. Oh, you're not crippled by the thought of improving, right? Then technically you should be willing to make mistakes. So that's what I'm willing to do. I know this video is not perfect and you can never be perfect. That's why fuck perfection. Imperfect actions lead to perfect outcomes. But perfect actions would never lead to any outcome. Off the cuff. That's a quote by G. Take it to the grave. See you in the next video.